Live from Washington, D.C., this is Transport Topics Newsmakers, the digital interview series that gives you access to candid conversations between industry experts and a veteran reporter.
Sponsored by Landstar.
Here's your host, Dan Ronan.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of Newsmakers from Transport Topics. I'm Dan Ronan. I'm pleased to host this regular conversation with leading figures in the trucking, freight, and logistics industries. We welcome back Rebecca Brewster. She is the president of ATRI, the American Transportation Research Institute. She'll be joining us from Atlanta in just a few moments. But first, before we get to our conversation with Rebecca, let's hear a word from our sponsor, the good folks at Landstar, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Our unparalleled transportation service starts with the trusted relationships formed among our unique network of entrepreneurs, independent agents, owner-operators, and employees. Landstar customers receive personalized service and operations expertise from independent Landstar agents and truck owner-operators, who in turn receive resources and back-office support from Landstar for truckload, LTL, heavy specialized, expedited, air, ocean, or rail intermodal. Count on trusted relationships with Landstar agents and owner-operators who bring their own specialized expertise to the table. When it comes to connecting customers with the people best suited to provide innovative solutions, the choice is Landstar.
Now, a few words about our guest, Rebecca Brewster. She's been with ATRI now for almost 31 years, and she is the president and COO since 2002. ATRI is the trucking industry's not-for-profit research organization, whose mission is to research to improve the trucking industry's safety and productivity. She's the recipient of several awards, including Fleet Owner Magazine's Dozen Outstanding Women in Trucking, as well as many others. Rebecca, it's good to have you back on Newsmakers. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Dan. I always appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and your listeners about what we've got underway at ATRI.
We want to talk as much as we can today, Rebecca, about driver-focused issues and things that are being done in the trucking and the freight industry to improve the situation for drivers. But you've got a new report out talking about safety and about how those trucking firms, those fleets that are involved with state associations and that are involved tend to have a much better safety record. What can you tell us?
They do indeed. And so this is a topic that has been discussed by our Research Advisory Committee for a number of years, because as you know, our Research Advisory Committee, the group that determines what research we will do, includes several state trucking association representatives. And the question is, what is the relationship between a carrier's safety performance and their involvement with a state trucking association or a national association? And so is it just because safer carriers tend to be the good guys and gals who join their associations and support their industry at a state or national level? Or is there some relationship that being a member of the association has on a carrier's safety performance? And so we actually developed a methodology that statistically corroborates the fact that current members of associations are safer than those who have left an association within the past 10 years, who are safer than those who have never been members of associations. And so it's that chronological safety relationship that's really important, that really points to the fact that membership in association and exposure to the things that associations provide, networking, training, information, guidance, actually helps a carrier improve their safety performance. So we looked at two metrics. We looked at crash involvement across all crash types, and we looked at violations per inspection. And on both of those metrics, we found statistically significant findings that again points to current members of associations are safer than former members who are safer than never members.
So the bottom line here is be a member, stay a member.
It is. Take advantage of what your state association or your national association provides you, because those resources are critical to expanding your knowledge base and learning best practices from your peers in the industry who are also those safer carriers, and really just rising the tide for all motor carriers in the industry.
What does this say for individual drivers then? Does this applicable then for people who run small fleets, 5, 7, 3 trucks? Should they also be involved as in state associations as well? I mean, some people will say, "Well, I'm just a little guy. It doesn't matter. I'm running my own shop. It really doesn't matter." But that you're saying this research dispels that.
It does, in fact, Dan, and we very carefully designed the methodology to draw membership lists of current members and former members from large state associations, but also small state associations. And quite frankly, at the state association level, you generally see smaller fleets that are based generally within the state or more regionally focused. And so by design, they're going to be smaller carriers for the most part, but they're also going to be, more regionally focused. So we had a geographic dispersion or distribution of the state associations from whom we drew data. So we've got a big state association out west and a small state association out west because their memberships are a little different. Same in the Midwest, same in the Northeast and in the Southeast. And so it really is a very representative sample. And so these results do apply to fleets regardless of size.
Rebecca, since we want to talk about the focus of drivers as much as we can today, if you could be in charge of the world for a couple days, so to speak, and change a couple things, what would be the 1 or 2 things you would do to improve the overall conditions for the drivers, the men and women who are out there? What would you do?
Well, I always say that truck parking is the Rebecca Brewster, or the lack of truck parking is the Rebecca Brewster soapbox issue. And I am so passionate about this one because, Dan, when I started on this job in 1993, 30 plus years ago, we were studying the issue of the lack of available truck parking. Now, fast forward to 2023, and it is still, unfortunately, a topic we're talking about. And I think as a nation, not just the trucking industry, but as a nation, we owe it to the men and women who deliver for us each and every day to provide for them an opportunity to get rest in a safe place where they can feel safe going to sleep to get their mandated rest. And right now, that situation does not exist because of the lack of available parking. And I don't care where you travel in this country, you will undoubtedly, if you are on the road early in the morning, see trucks parked on shoulders and ramps to rest areas and interstate interchanges because those drivers do not have another safe place to park, and that's where they're forced to get their rest.
But the other night I was driving up to Baltimore, and I was going along Interstate 95, and I came to a rest area in Howard County, which is between DC and Baltimore. And there must have been 15 or 20 trucks lined up trying to get into this rest stop. And they were just stopped on the side of the road, pulled over as far as they could onto the shoulder or onto the exit ramp. And you're right, it really is terribly unsafe. And just a couple of weeks ago in Southern Illinois, we had that horrific accident involving a Greyhound bus, a professional driver who something happened and hit a couple trucks. And sadly, we had fatalities in that. People on the Greyhound died.
It just is, it's a bad situation for everyone, Dan. I mean, when you think about trucks parked on the shoulder or ramps, we talk a lot about the state of the nation's infrastructure. Well, that infrastructure is not designed to hold large commercial vehicles like that. It creates a safety problem, certainly for the truck driver who has to, navigate in and out of their vehicle, and they're sitting there sort of exposed, much like in the case of this Illinois crash. But it also creates a situation for the four-wheelers or car drivers that have to navigate around those vehicles. So that's a tough situation. It creates a bad situation for law enforcement. It really puts them between a rock and a hard place because it's not legal for you to park on the shoulders and ramps. That's not designated truck parking. But yet law enforcement knows that drivers have to get their rest, that they're under federal hours of service rules. And if they start that truck up again because an enforcement officer has told them to move on down the road, they're in violation of their hours of service rules. So it really just is a bad situation for everyone. And it's why it is routinely ranked as a top concern in our annual top industry issues survey in the overall top 10, but certainly among the driver respondents to that survey, Dan, it is regularly number one or number two as their top concerns.
The federal government recently announced it's going to spend about $750 million to start acquiring land and the real estate to do what it needs to do. $750 million is a lot of money, but is that enough?
Well, I'm certainly pleased to see a focus at the federal level, recognizing that this is an issue for certainly for drivers, but for the greater supply chain and the nation's economy. But we need to do more. But it doesn't just take adding more spaces. There are other things we can do, and that's where a lot of ATRI's research has been focused and is going to continue to be focused. Things like information systems, truck parking information systems, changeable message signs along the roadways that tell drivers how many available spaces there are in real time at an upcoming exit. Saves the driver time so they don't have to pull off wondering if there's parking. They know what's coming so they can make the choice to pull over or continue on down the road.
What is the private sector's role in this?
Well, certainly the private sector is a provider of truck parking when you think about all the travel plazas and truck stops around the country. And I think as an industry, we need to be partners with the private sector in terms of when they are applying to build new facilities or expand existing facilities, be their partner to advocate for them and on their behalf at the local level when they face zoning regulations that might prohibit that new siting or expansion. But the private sector also extends to our customers in the trucking industry and shippers and receivers who have large facilities, which means they also have parking available. And so where they can provide parking for drivers, particularly when those drivers are held up excessively in detention, to let those drivers stay there in that safe harbor to get their mandated rest.
What about the phenomenon, you know where I'm going here with this, Rebecca, and that is not in my backyard, that people, they want their products delivered, they want their packages delivered as quickly as possible, but they don't want a truck parking terminal anywhere near their home or their apartment because it, in their minds, could impact the value of their property, their real estate.
And that is a real issue for us, Dan, because where some of the most critical parking needs exist are in and around large metropolitan areas, like here in Atlanta. And, you've got this sort of conundrum of expensive real estate because there's high population density and high demand for the land, but that means that drives a lot of demand for stuff that's brought on trucks. And so you're right, it is a real frustration for us who recognize this issue that everybody wants the stuff that's brought on truck and they want it now, but they don't want to provide the basic human necessity of providing a safe place for those drivers to rest. And we as a nation need to change that mindset.
How do you do it?
Education. We have to do a lot more education of the public to connect the dots for them between consumer demand and how they get that product and the fact that that's a human being, a fellow human being driving that vehicle who needs the opportunity to rest. I mean, the fact that we have to have state legislation introduced that would allow and provide access to restrooms for the men and women who deliver we should all be ashamed that it has come to that.
Yeah, that was a very troubling story indeed, wasn't it? That a state legislature actually had to introduce a law to mandate that drivers, men and women who make deliveries at a facility, be allowed to use the bathrooms to go to take care of their own personal business. I mean, that's a tough one to swallow, isn't it?
It is indeed. And so I, for my very small part and role in this, I make a commitment to the nation's drivers that I do not do a presentation. And I do, as you know, Dan, I'm on the road constantly all year long doing presentations. I do not do a presentation that this issue is not raised with the audience, that we have got to do better by the men and women who deliver for us.
Rebecca, we hear so much from ATRI about the issue of congestion. And as I recall in the last report that your organization put out, that there's a little bit of improvement as the infrastructure bill worked its way through, and we're starting to see the federal money get to the cities, the states, the local governments. A couple of notable interchanges. The Jane Byrne in Chicago got a little better, but a lot of the same trouble spots are still the same trouble spots. Fort Lee, New Jersey, anywhere on 285 in Atlanta, your city and my former place where I lived for many years, 635 in Texas. There's a trend here, isn't there?
There is, and again, it's those centers where there's population growth drives increased demand for freight, means we have more trucks and more cars sharing the same infrastructure, and the end result is congestion. We do our annual bottleneck analysis. As you point out, a lot of the locations stay on that top 10 list and don't move out of there. Fort Lee, New Jersey has been the #1 truck bottleneck on our list for a number of years. And it's important for folks to understand that when we develop this list, it's not a survey. What do you think is the worst place? No. That the data actually generates from truck GPS data, hundreds of thousands of freight trucks worth of GPS data that comes into ATRI to do these analyses. So we see a lot of the same places continue to be bad. Some get a little better. For instance, you mentioned the Byrne interchange. As a construction project to improve that interchange is completed, we see the fruits of that labor, if you will, in terms of reduced congestion at that area. But on the flip side of that, we were very pleased as an industry to get the infrastructure bill and finally have federal dollars committed to improving our infrastructure. But with those infrastructure improvement projects comes additional congestion. So it's going to be tough for a while, with the end goal in sight of improving those times. But we are, Dan, actually in the process and going to release in the next month and a half, an update to our cost of congestion study, which we did last in 2016, where we looked at how much congestion costs the trucking industry at a national level and at a state by state level, because it is different based on what state you're in. How much lost productivity that means. In our last study, it was 1.2 billion hours of lost productivity. It was the equivalent, congestion on the national highway system in the US, the equivalent of 425,000 truck drivers sitting still for an entire year because of congestion. So you talk about the need for additional drivers in this industry. If we could just do something about congestion, we could almost all but eliminate that need for additional drivers. If we could just get the drivers we have on the road moving more efficiently within less congestion.
It sounds very much like the philosophy that the late Herb Kelleher, the founder and CEO of Southwest Airlines, said, if I can just run my airline a little more efficiently every day, I don't have to buy 3 747s, and 3 747s are expensive.
Absolutely. It's the same thought process here. If we could just allow drivers, if we could, snap our fingers and congestion be gone, our drivers would be able to move much more efficiently. We'd still have to deal with the congestion at the customer facilities, that detention, but at least the time that those drivers spent driving would be actually driving and not sitting stuck in traffic congestion, which contributes to environmental issues because we're just sitting there essentially idling our trucks while we're stuck in traffic. And I always have to remind people, while our data comes from trucks and we document where trucks are having a hard time moving, they're not the only ones in that traffic stream. And so car drivers are sitting stuck in that same traffic, and it's just creating problems for everyone.
Rebecca, there's been a lot of discussion about how we are in a freight recession, comparatively speaking, coming down from the high of the pandemic when everyone was buying refrigerators and computers and furniture for the house and all the things that they were. What does this mean for drivers? What does this mean now that we are in a bit of a trough? It'll come out of it like it always does. It's a cyclical industry. But what does this mean for the drivers, the men and women who are out there?
Well, certainly it's particularly if you're an owner, operator, independent contractor, it is a tougher environment in which to be successful and make a living because of the softening of the freight demand. But you're right, it is cyclical, and we do see it sort of ebb and flow. When we see that play out a lot in our annual top industry issues survey, where when freight is hot, we see driver shortage and driver retention as some of the top issues on the survey. And when the economy cools a little bit, we see those issues start to move down the list and replaced by others. For instance, the state of the nation's economy then rises up because everyone's concerned about how we're going to get out of, if there is a recession at that time, how we're going to get out of it.
So there is a lot to be said for that. We also recently lost one of the largest carriers in the country in the case of Yellow, shutting down and now filing for bankruptcy. This puts 22,000 drivers into the marketplace. Does this help with the driver shortage? I mean, is it a good time for these men and women to be out there looking for employment?
Well, certainly it's tough in terms of the sort of sluggish demand, but there is such a need for drivers that I am hopeful that, the men and women who I know worked for Yellow, have a lot of good friends who were drivers there. I am hopeful that they will find gainful employment with other carriers at this time.
To the issue of driver pay, it went up for several years. I mean, we were looking at many companies that were raising pay quarterly, especially during the pandemic. Has that cooled now? Has that started to back down a little bit?
Well, Dan, that's a topic we have tracked for a number of years through our annual operational costs of trucking. And so we recently released the latest version of ops cost, and it was reporting on 2022 data. And in that report, we saw just over a 15% increase in the driver wage cost per mile over 21. So still seeing those costs go up from 21 to 22. We see the driver wage cost per mile, because that's another metric we track, continue to increase as well. Not quite at the same rate as the driver wage per mile, but we are seeing the driver benefit cost per mile go up. The other thing we track in that research, Dan, is what are other forms of compensation that fleets are providing? So are there performance bonuses that fleets are providing? And so we have average annual amounts for safety performance and referral bonuses and retention bonuses and starting bonuses. And we have seen those numbers, at least over the last 5 years, continue to climb as fleets are finding other ways to compensate drivers beyond what they're just paying to keep that truck moving.
Is there a move, Rebecca, in the industry to move away from what has been this traditional pay by the mile type of pay to where there's a guaranteed rate for drivers? They get a guarantee that they know they're going to make a certain amount of money every week, or hourly rates. Is this becoming more prevalent?
We are seeing a variety of different pay models being deployed in the industry, both through our operational costs of trucking research and some other research we've done looking at the differences between company drivers and owner-operators, independent contractors. And fleets are responding to the need to attract and retain the best drivers. And they're doing that in a variety of ways. There are like these safety performance bonuses or overall performance bonuses like we talked about. There are, as you indicated, pay models where drivers are guaranteed a certain level of compensation on an annualized basis. Hourly pay, we're seeing more fleets look at hourly pay as an option. But the challenge is that this industry, in terms of its operations, is so diverse. I mean, a regional carrier who just goes out 100, 200 miles per day is a different operation than an over-the-road operation. And so their drivers are different. So their pay schema are different. And it's a challenging topic to do an apples to apples comparison on.
We've seen in the last several weeks that rising fuel prices, they've started going back up again pretty aggressively. This after a year of almost steady declines. What is this doing? I know a lot of companies have fuel surcharges and they will actually make some money on the fuel surcharge. But what are you hearing in terms of what the rising fuel prices are doing in terms of the impact on the industry right now?
So, Dan, referring back to our operational costs of trucking, in this most recent report, this was the first time we saw the cost per mile to operate a truck go over $2, a little over $2.25. And one of the biggest jumps and biggest contributors to that, of course, was fuel costs. And so from 21 to 22, we saw fuel costs go up, the fuel cost per mile go up over 53%. As you indicate, how that impacts a fleet really does, in many cases, depend on their size. And so while everyone feels the pain at the pump, larger fleets have the ability to deploy and more regularly deploy fuel surcharges with their customers. When you look at an individual owner operator, independent contractor, it's a little more challenging because their market is a different place and their negotiating power is a little different. And so in our 2022 top industry issues survey, we had over 4,200 respondents from all parts of the industry. Nearly half of those respondents were professional truck drivers, Dan, and among those, about 27% were owner operators. Fuel prices, their number one concern. Fuel prices, the number one concern overall in the industry, because everyone was feeling pain at the pump. Even 5 months ago, or a month ago, I would have said fuel price is not likely to be the top issue in this year's top industry issues survey, but we are starting to see it creep up again. So when we launch the survey in a couple of weeks, it will be interesting to see where fuel prices comes in overall.
Is there since we're talking about diesel as the primary fuel, is there I hate to use the word excitement, but that's the closest word that comes to mind. Is there an anticipation that as we look at hydrogen, as we look at battery electric, as we look at natural gas, some of these other fuels that are in the pipeline that are being researched right now, that maybe fuel will be a lesser expense going forward if diesel eventually is no longer the dominant fuel and one of the others is, that maybe fuel won't be as big a deal?
I think right now, what the industry is faced with in terms with transitioning to zero emission vehicles is the upfront cost of the vehicle itself. And so it's hard to sort of see down the line that, I'm going to have an eventual savings in my fuel price, because it's going to cost me so much to make that investment in the initial equipment. Not even talking about, is there the infrastructure to refuel, if you will, or power those vehicles? That's a whole separate issue. But it's that initial upfront cost that makes it hard to see, a silver lining in terms of reduced fuel costs.
Rebecca, one topic we haven't touched on, and I want to spend about 4 or 5 minutes on this as we conclude our conversation, and that is nuclear verdicts and the revolution that's been taking place among the plaintiff side with regards to finding out new ways to try cases, and the pushback that the trucking industry and the defense lawyers are now starting to mount. There's been some big wins, the state of Iowa, the state of Florida, a couple of others as well. But this is going to be a slog for the trucking industry to push back here, isn't it?
It is. And the issue of lawsuit abuse reform, we see it on the top industry issues survey overall. We also see it even rank higher on the motor carrier side of the equation. And it's very closely tied, and in fact, ranks right next to insurance cost and availability, because it's very hard to separate those two. When there are more nuclear verdicts, the insurers take more of a hit and therefore have to adjust premiums. And so, Dan, this is a topic we've done a lot of study on at ATRI, and we've documented tremendous growth in not only the frequency of what we call nuclear verdicts, those that are 10 million or above, but the sheer size of them. And in our research that we released several years ago, we saw a nearly 1,000% increase in the size of nuclear verdicts against the trucking industry, just under a 10-year period of time. So very dramatic growth, both in frequency and size of these verdicts. And, it plays itself out in a number of ways, but unfortunately, it also plays itself out in trucking fleets shutting their doors because they simply can't afford the rising cost of insurance as a result of these verdicts.
But again, there has been some wins, Florida, as well as the state of Iowa, the others. It is going to be a state-by-state slog, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And because the laws are so different state to state, it really is going to have to be a battle that is fought at, and in the cases like Iowa and Florida, won at the state level. And it would be interesting to, this would take time, but it would be interesting to revisit our nuclear verdict study, particularly in those states, 5 years post passage of that legislation to see if we can quantify a change in the size of verdicts and the type of verdicts that are handed down in those states.
Rebecca, before we leave, I just want to, I know you like to give a tip of the cap to the folks at the RAC committee that does a lot of the really hard work for your organization, for ATRI. What are some of the things that the RAC committee, when they had their last meeting, they decided upon this is going to be where we go for 23-24?
So the number one priority identified is going back to my soapbox issue of truck parking, and I swear I didn't influence the voting here, but we really were looking at, in this particular research priority, or are going to be looking at, are there ways to expand the parking that is available and provided for by the public sector? So can we increase the number of spots at public rest areas? Can we look at unique things that states are doing to provide public sector or truck parking at public sector facilities like permanent way stations? Can we revisit states that limit the amount of time a commercial driver can park at their rest areas that doesn't allow them to utilize those facilities for their mandated hours of service rest? So a whole suite of case studies, if you will, around public sector provision of truck parking. We're also going to look at ways we can tear down the barriers, if you will, to bring more women into the industry. Certainly the truck parking issue is one, but there are others that we will be examining. We're going to look at the diesel technician shortage and what does it look like today and what can we do to start to mitigate that shortage and get young people interested in careers as diesel technicians. Another one we're looking at, Dan, is the cost of driver detention. So it always ranks highly on the motor carrier and on the driver list, and it comes with a cost. And so quantifying that cost to the overall supply chain and economy as drivers sit there stuck at a customer's facility will be the goal of that research.
A lot on your plate.
We do, but we love what we do, Dan. Got a very talented team at ATRI.
Well, Rebecca, I should also point out that all of ATRI's research is available online and it is free. And just go to the website, truckingresearch.org. That's truckingresearch.org. Rebecca, always good to talk to you.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Rebecca Brewster from ATRI joining. In closing, we want to thank Rebecca Brewster with ATRI for being so generous with her time to answer our questions here on this edition of Newsmakers. And we also want to thank our sponsor for this edition, Landstar. And you heard that great commercial message from them at the top. We appreciate Landstar's support. This webcast will be available for on-demand viewing. Go to ttnews.com for more information how you can watch our full interview with Rebecca Brewster. We'll also rebroadcast the audio portion of this interview on Sirius XM on the radio program Transport Topics, channel 146. Stay tuned for more details on that as well. Again, for Rebecca Brewster with ATRI, I'm Dan Ronan, TT News. We thank you for watching.
Thank you for joining us today. For more information on future episodes, visit ttnews.com. This has been Transport Topics Newsmakers.